In the summer of 1977, as the Cold War appeared to be settling into predictable lines of détente and proxy management, one of the most chaotic and revealing conflicts of the era erupted in the Horn of Africa, because the Ogaden War unfolded not as a simple clash between neighbors, but as a sudden inversion of alliances that exposed how fragile ideological commitments were when strategic opportunity emerged. And this mattered because within the span of months, two socialist states went to war with each other. The Soviet Union abandoned a long-standing client, embraced a former enemy, and Cuba deployed tens of thousands of troops thousands of miles from home, all in a conflict triggered by territorial ambition rather than ideological disagreement. And the roots of the war lay in the Ogaden region itself, a vast, arid territory inhabited largely by ethnic Somalis, but administered by Ethiopia, a legacy of imperial borders drawn and preserved without regard for ethnic continuity. And this unresolved tension had simmered since decolonization, because the Somali state that emerged in 1960 was built around a powerful nationalist vision of uniting all Somali inhabited lands, a project that placed it in direct conflict with Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti. And while these ambitions were temporarily constrained by Cold War alignments, they never disappeared, merely waiting for an opening. And that opening arrived in the aftermath of the Ethiopian Revolution, when the collapse of imperial authority and the violent consolidation of the Derg created the perception that Ethiopia was internally broken and militarily vulnerable. And this perception mattered because it encouraged Somali leadership to believe that a decisive strike could achieve long-held territorial goals before the new Ethiopian regime stabilized. And at the time, Somalia itself was governed by a military junta that proclaimed scientific socialism and maintained close ties with the Soviet Union, receiving arms, training, and advisors that transformed it into one of the best-equipped militaries in sub-Saharan Africa. And this alignment mattered because it initially placed both Somalia and Ethiopia within the socialist camp, creating a situation in which ideological allies were poised to fight a war of conquest against one another, a scenario that tested the coherence of Cold War bloc logic. And in July 1977, Somali forces crossed into the Ogaden in force, launching a rapid offensive that quickly overran much of the territory, supported by Western Somali Liberation Front fighters, who framed the invasion as a popular uprising rather than interstate aggression. And in the early weeks, the campaign appeared successful because Ethiopian forces were disorganized, purged by internal repression, and distracted by multiple insurgencies, reinforcing the belief that the revolution had fatally weakened the state. And this initial success mattered because it forced the superpowers to confront a crisis that did not conform to ideological expectations, as Moscow now faced the prospect of choosing between two socialist allies locked in open war, each demanding support. And this choice proved decisive, because the Soviet leadership ultimately judged Ethiopia's size, strategic position, and potential as more valuable than Somalia's claims, especially given Ethiopia's control of access to the Red Sea and proximity to the Middle East. And once that decision was made, the Cold War map of the Horn of Africa was redrawn almost overnight, with Soviet advisors expelled from Somalia, arms shipments redirected to Ethiopia, and a massive airlift organized to sustain Addis Abeba's war effort. And this abrupt reversal mattered because it demonstrated how ideological solidarity could be discarded instantly when strategic calculus shifted, revealing that the Cold War's most rigid doctrines were often subordinate to geography and power. And the intervention escalated further when Cuba, acting in coordination with Moscow, committed large combat forces to Ethiopia transforming what had begun as a regional war into a multinational proxy conflict. And this escalation mattered because it underscored how quickly local ambitions could trigger global intervention once credibility and influence were perceived to be at stake. And for Ethiopia, the influx of Soviet weapons and Cuban troops reversed the balance of power, allowing the Derg to stabilize its front lines, reorganize its forces, and frame the conflict as a defense of national sovereignty against foreign aggression, a narrative that helped legitimize further militarization and repression at home. And for Somalia, the sudden loss of Soviet backing was catastrophic because it exposed the limits of its autonomy as a client state and left it isolated at the very moment its gamble required sustained external support. And this isolation mattered because it forced Mogadishu to seek new patrons, accelerating its eventual pivot toward the West and revealing how rapidly Cold War alignments could flip when survival was at stake. And as the war intensified into late 1977 and early 1978, the Ogaden became the site of some of the largest conventional battles fought in Africa during the Cold War, with armor, artillery, and air power deployed on a scale that shattered any illusion that the conflict was a minor border dispute. And by early 1978, Ethiopian and Cuban forces launched a counteroffensive that pushed Somali troops out of the Ogaden, restoring the pre-war borders and ending Somalia's dream of territorial unification through force. And this outcome mattered because it not only confirmed Ethiopia's survival, but entrenched it as the Soviet Union's primary anchor in the Horn of Africa, while simultaneously plunging Somalia into long-term instability that would culminate in state collapse years later. And in this sense, the Ogaden War stands as one of the Cold War's most revealing proxy conflicts because it showed that alliances were not fixed, ideology was negotiable, and superpower intervention could decisively shape outcomes, even in wars driven by local nationalism, exposing the Cold War not as a stable bipolar order, but as a volatile system in which sudden reversals and opportunistic realignments were not anomalies, but features. As the war expanded beyond its opening phase, the Ogaden conflict rapidly revealed how superpower intervention could transform a regional gamble into a decisive confrontation, shaped less by local aims than by external logistics, because once the Soviet Union committed fully to Ethiopia, the character of the war shifted from fluid maneuver to industrial-scale attrition. And this mattered because it demonstrated how quickly the balance of power in Cold War Africa could be altered not by ideology or morale, but by airlift capacity, command integration, and the willingness of external actors to escalate. And for Ethiopia, the sudden influx of Soviet weapons fundamentally changed its military capabilities, as modern tanks, artillery, aircraft, and communications equipment arrived in volumes unmatched elsewhere on the continent, allowing the Derg to rebuild forces that had been shattered by purges and internal conflict, while Soviet advisors helped reorganize command structures and plan large-scale operations. And this transformation mattered because it converted Ethiopia from a fragile revolutionary state into a heavily militarized client whose survival now depended on sustained external backing. And alongside Soviet material came Cuban troops, whose deployment marked one of the most extraordinary instances of long-range intervention in the Cold War, as tens of thousands of soldiers were transported across the Atlantic to fight in a conflict with no direct connection to Cuban national interests, underscoring the degree to which ideological alignment and alliance discipline could override geographic logic. And this Cuban involvement mattered because it provided Ethiopia with experienced combat forces at a critical moment, tipping the balance decisively and signaling that Moscow was willing to escalate beyond advisory support to secure its position in the Horn of Africa. and as Ethiopian and Cuban forces coordinated their counteroffensive, the Somali advance stalled and then collapsed under sustained pressure, exposing the limits of Somalia's initial advantage and the vulnerability of a military whose strength depended heavily on uninterrupted external supply. And for Somalia, the sudden reversal was devastating, because the loss of Soviet support not only deprived it of weapons and advisors, but also shattered its strategic assumptions, leaving its forces overextended and unable to withstand the combined weight of Ethiopian manpower and external firepower. And this collapse mattered because it illustrated the risks inherent in client-state autonomy during the Cold War, showing that alignment could empower aggressive action but could be withdrawn instantly when it conflicted with patron priorities. And as Somali troops retreated from the Ogaden, the war's outcome became increasingly inevitable. Yet the human and political costs continued to mount, because the conflict displaced large civilian populations, intensified repression within Ethiopia under the banner of national defense, and deepened militarization across the region. And this militarization mattered because it locked both states into security-first postures that would outlast the war itself, shaping domestic governance and foreign policy for years to come. And at the international level, the Ogaden War sent a shock through Cold War diplomacy because it exposed the fluidity of bloc politics and the willingness of superpowers to reverse alliances publicly and decisively, undermining the notion of predictable ideological camps and reinforcing the reality that strategic geography ultimately trumped doctrinal consistency. And as the fighting drew toward its conclusion in early 1978, the Ogaden War stood as a stark reminder that in the Cold War's peripheral theaters, the decisive battles were often determined not by the grievances that sparked them, but by the speed and scale with which external powers chose to intervene, turning local ambitions into global calculations, and ensuring that the fate of entire regions could hinge on decisions made far from the battlefield. As the counteroffensive gathered momentum, the Ogaden War increasingly illustrated how superpower escalation could compress time and overwhelm local agency, because the speed with which Ethiopia recovered and reversed its losses depended almost entirely on the external machinery now sustaining it. And this mattered because it stripped the conflict of any remaining ambiguity about its nature, transforming it into a textbook example of Cold War proxy warfare, where outcomes were decided less by the original combatants than by the patrons standing behind them. And for Ethiopia, the war became a crucible in which the Derg fused national survival with ideological alignment, framing victory not only as territorial defense, but as proof of revolutionary legitimacy, a narrative that justified further repression and centralized control under the guise of wartime necessity. And this framing mattered because it allowed the regime to silence dissent by equating opposition with treason, deepening the internal violence that had already accompanied the revolution. And for Somalia, the experience was equally transformative, but in the opposite direction, because defeat exposed the fragility of its state-building project and the dangers of conflating nationalist ambition with client-state power, leaving the regime weakened, isolated, and forced into a rapid reorientation of foreign policy that would draw it toward Western support without restoring its lost credibility at home. And this pivot mattered because it underscored the transactional nature of Cold War alliances, where ideological labels could be discarded overnight in the pursuit of survival. And as the fighting concluded with Ethiopian and Cuban forces reestablishing control over the Ogaden, the war's immediate military outcome masked its longer-term consequences, because while borders were restored, the region was left destabilized, militarized, and deeply scarred by displacement and repression, ensuring that the conflict's legacy would persist long after the last shots were fired. And this persistence mattered because it revealed how proxy wars often ended, not with resolution, but with the freezing of grievances under renewed coercion, setting the stage for future instability. And at the global level, the Ogaden War sent a clear signal that the Horn of Africa had become a strategic arena where superpower credibility would be defended aggressively, elevating the region's importance within Cold War calculations and drawing sustained external attention that further entrenched militarization. And this elevation mattered because it ensured that subsequent conflicts in the area would be interpreted through the lens of great power competition rather than local reconciliation, narrowing the space for negotiated solutions. And as analysts assessed the war's lessons, they emphasized how quickly ideology had been subordinated to geography, because Ethiopia's control of access to the Red Sea and proximity to the Middle East proved decisive in Moscow's calculus. While Somalia's claims, however deeply rooted in nationalist sentiment, were deemed expendable, and this hierarchy mattered because it revealed the underlying structure of Cold War decision-making, where strategic position outweighed loyalty and rhetoric. And in this sense, the Ogaden War stands as a moment when the Cold War's rules were briefly exposed in their rawest form, showing that alliances were conditional, interventions decisive, and local ambitions ultimately secondary to the imperatives of global rivalry, ensuring that the war would be remembered not only for its chaos, but for the clarity with which it demonstrated how power operated on the Cold War's periphery. As the war receded from headlines and the Horn of Africa absorbed the consequences of the Ogaden defeat, the conflict's deeper Cold War significance became increasingly apparent, because what appeared at first as a short, decisive war had in fact restructured the regional balance of power in ways that would endure for decades. And this mattered because the Ogaden War did not simply determine control over a sparsely populated territory, but permanently altered the political trajectories of both Ethiopia and Somalia, while confirming the Horn of Africa as a zone where superpower intervention could be sudden, massive, and unapologetic. And for Ethiopia, the victory cemented the Derg's authority at a moment when internal legitimacy remained fragile, allowing the regime to present itself as the defender of national sovereignty against foreign aggression, a narrative that proved invaluable in consolidating power and suppressing internal opposition. And this mattered because it fused nationalism with Marxist rule, creating a political identity that justified prolonged militarization and repression under the banner of revolutionary defense. And at the same time, the scale of Soviet and Cuban involvement entrenched Ethiopia's dependence on external patrons, locking the regime into a relationship that traded autonomy for survival, a trade that would shape policy decisions long after the war ended. And for Somalia, the defeat proved catastrophic, because the loss of the Ogaden shattered the regime's central nationalist promise, exposing the gap between ambition and capacity and accelerating internal fragmentation. And this mattered because it marked the beginning of a long decline, as the state turned inward, relied increasingly on repression, and sought new external backers to compensate for lost legitimacy, setting in motion dynamics that would eventually culminate in state collapse. And at the regional level, the war intensified insecurity as arms flowed freely, borders hardened, and neighboring states adjusted their policies to a new reality in which Ethiopia had emerged as a heavily armed regional power backed by a superpower coalition. And this militarization mattered because it reduced incentives for compromise and entrenched suspicion, ensuring that future conflicts would be approached through force rather than negotiation. And globally, the Ogaden War delivered a shock to Cold War assumptions, because it demonstrated that ideological alignment was provisional and reversible, that client states could be abandoned overnight, and that strategic geography trumped loyalty, a lesson absorbed by leaders across the global South, who now understood that superpower support was conditional and contingent. And this realization mattered because it encouraged opportunism, hedging, and rapid realignment as rational survival strategies in a volatile international system. And as historians later assessed the war, they emphasized how its most lasting impact lay not in territorial outcomes, but in the exposure of Cold War mechanics, revealing a system driven less by ideology than by leverage, logistics, and credibility. And in this sense, the Ogaden War stands as one of the Cold War's most instructive proxy conflicts, because it stripped away illusions about alliance permanence and ideological solidarity, showing instead a world in which power could pivot abruptly, reshape wars overnight, and determine the fate of regions far removed from the centers of decision-making, ensuring that the chaos of the Ogaden was not an anomaly, but a window into how the Cold War truly operated at its edges. As the longer shadow of the Ogaden War stretched across the late Cold War period, its role as a cautionary example of proxy volatility became increasingly clear because the conflict demonstrated that once superpowers intervened decisively, local wars ceased to belong to the societies that fought them. And this mattered because it exposed how quickly indigenous political goals could be overridden by external strategic imperatives, transforming nationalist projects into liabilities and revolutionary regimes into instruments of larger contests. And for Ethiopia, the war's aftermath reinforced a governing logic in which security took precedence over reconciliation, embedding the military at the center of political life and normalizing permanent mobilization as a condition of survival, a posture that shaped domestic policy and regional behavior for years to come. And this mattered because it ensured that the grievances which had fueled both the revolution and the war remained unresolved, merely suppressed beneath an expanding security apparatus. And for Somalia, the consequences were even more destabilizing, as defeat not only discredited the regime's ideological claims, but exposed the fragility of a state whose cohesion depended heavily on external patronage and nationalist success. And this exposure mattered because it accelerated the erosion of authority, pushing the government toward increasingly authoritarian measures that deepened internal division rather than restoring legitimacy. And at the regional level, the Ogaden War entrenched a pattern of militarized rivalry in the Horn of Africa, where arms accumulation, suspicion, and external alignment became the default responses to insecurity, reducing the space for diplomatic engagement and increasing the likelihood that future disputes would escalate rapidly. And this militarization mattered because it locked the region into a cycle of conflict management rather than conflict resolution, a dynamic reinforced by continued superpower interest. And internationally, the war's lessons resonated beyond Africa, because leaders in other parts of the global South absorbed the reality that Cold War alliances were transactional and reversible, encouraging strategic flexibility, but also deepening cynicism about ideological commitments. And this realization mattered because it reshaped how states navigated superpower competition, favoring short-term advantage over long-term alignment. And as analysts later revisited the Ogaden War, they noted that its most revealing feature was not the speed of alliance reversal, but the ease with which it was accepted, as ideological inconsistency provoked remarkably little protest once strategic logic was invoked, underscoring how Cold War norms privileged outcome over coherence. And in this sense, the Ogaden War stands as a distilled example of proxy conflict dynamics, showing how local ambition, revolutionary upheaval, and superpower calculation could collide to produce sudden escalation, rapid realignment, and enduring instability. And by tracing this collision, the war reveals the deeper mechanics of the Cold War's periphery, where chaos was not an aberration, but an expected byproduct of a system that rewarded strategic position over political legitimacy, ensuring that the costs of rivalry were borne disproportionately by regions whose fate could change overnight, with a decision made far beyond their borders. As the memory of the Ogaden War settled into Cold War history, it became increasingly clear that the conflict's true significance lay in how nakedly it exposed the machinery of superpower competition when stripped of ideological pretense. Because the war demonstrated that alliances were instruments rather than commitments, activated and discarded according to shifting assessments of value. And this mattered because it revealed a system in which client states were empowered to act boldly only so long as their ambitions aligned with patron interests, after which they could be abandoned without hesitation. And for Ethiopia, the war confirmed a grim formula for survival: that external backing could compensate for internal illegitimacy, allowing a regime to endure through force even as social cohesion deteriorated. And this mattered because it entrenched a model of governance in which repression was not a temporary response to crisis, but a permanent feature justified by perpetual insecurity. And for Somalia, the lesson was equally stark, because the loss of Soviet support transformed defeat into long-term unraveling, exposing how quickly a state's strategic relevance could evaporate and how devastating that evaporation could be for internal stability, accelerating processes of fragmentation that no subsequent realignment could fully reverse. And at the regional level, the war institutionalized suspicion and militarization as default conditions, ensuring that the Horn of Africa would remain locked into cycles of confrontation, shaped as much by external interests as by local disputes. And this mattered because it reduced the likelihood that future crises would be addressed through political compromise rather than force, reinforcing the Cold War pattern in which proxy regions became arenas of managed instability. And internationally, the Ogaden War contributed to a broader erosion of ideological credibility, as observers recognized that socialism and anti-imperial rhetoric could be subordinated instantly to strategic calculus, weakening the moral authority of bloc politics and encouraging a more transactional approach to alignment across the global South. And this shift mattered because it altered how leaders understood survival in a bipolar world, privileging adaptability over loyalty and reinforcing the sense that power, not principle, ultimately determined outcomes. And in this sense, the Ogaden War stands as one of the Cold War's clearest illustrations of how local ambition, revolutionary upheaval, and superpower intervention could collide to produce chaos that was rational from the perspective of strategy, but catastrophic for the societies involved, revealing a system that could pivot with breathtaking speed while leaving behind enduring damage. And by exposing these dynamics so openly, the war offered a rare moment of clarity about how the Cold War functioned beyond summit meetings and treaties, showing that at its edges, the rules were brutally simple. Influence was pursued wherever it could be secured. Alliances were expendable, and the costs of reversal were paid not by the powers that decided, but by the regions forced to absorb the consequences. As the analytical distance from the Ogaden War widened, the conflict increasingly came to be understood as a warning about the instability inherent in Cold War proxy systems, because it showed that when regional actors attempted to exploit moments of revolutionary weakness, they risked triggering interventions that would overwhelm their agency entirely. And this mattered because Somalia's decision to invade the Ogaden was rational within a narrow window of opportunity, but catastrophic. Once superpower priorities shifted, illustrating how quickly initiative could turn into vulnerability in a system governed by external escalation. And for Ethiopia, the war's outcome entrenched a dangerous dependency, as victory achieved through foreign power reduced incentives for internal reconciliation and reform, reinforcing a governing model that equated security with militarization and dissent with betrayal. And this mattered because it ensured that the regime's survival was decoupled from social well-being, allowing crises to be managed through force rather than resolved through political inclusion. And at the same time, the war reshaped perceptions of intervention itself, because the scale and speed of Soviet and Cuban involvement demonstrated that superpowers were willing to deploy enormous resources to peripheral theaters when credibility and access were perceived to be at stake, contradicting assumptions that Africa would remain a secondary concern. And this mattered because it elevated the Horn of Africa into a strategic crossroads, ensuring sustained attention and competition that further militarized the region. And as later conflicts unfolded nearby, the precedent set by the Ogaden War lingered, encouraging both local actors and external powers to view escalation as a viable tool rather than a last resort, narrowing the space for diplomacy. And in Cold War historiography, the Ogaden War thus occupies a pivotal place because it encapsulates the volatility of alliance politics, the primacy of geography over ideology, and the human cost of rapid realignment, revealing a world in which decisions made in Moscow and Havana could determine the fate of campaigns launched in Addis Ababa and Mogadishu. And by exposing these dynamics with unusual clarity, the conflict stands as a case study in how proxy wars operated at their most extreme, showing that when superpowers rushed in, they did not stabilize fragile regions so much as lock them into patterns of coercion and dependency that outlasted the fighting itself, ensuring that the legacy of the Ogaden War would be measured not only in territorial lines restored, but in decades of instability shaped by the sudden and decisive intrusion of global rivalry into local ambition. As the Ogaden War faded from immediate memory, but not from consequence, its enduring Cold War lesson became the exposure of how speed, not deliberation, governed intervention on the periphery, because the conflict demonstrated that once a strategic calculation was made, escalation could unfold faster than diplomacy or restraint could intervene. And this mattered because it showed that proxy wars were not slow-moving chess games, but sudden storms in which alignment, logistics, and force converged with overwhelming effect. And for Ethiopia, the rapid reversal of fortune reinforced the belief that survival depended on remaining indispensable to a patron, encouraging policies that prioritized strategic reliability over domestic legitimacy, a logic that deepened authoritarian governance and entrenched militarization long after the war ended. And this mattered because it ensured that victory did not translate into stability, but into a hardened state apparatus oriented toward control rather than reconciliation. And for Somalia, the speed of abandonment was equally instructive, because it revealed that even a well-armed client could be rendered strategically irrelevant overnight, exposing the fragility of power derived from external support and accelerating internal decay once that support vanished. And this mattered because it demonstrated how quickly defeat could cascade into systemic collapse when legitimacy and capacity were already thin. And at the regional level, the Ogaden War confirmed that the Horn of Africa had become a proving ground for Cold War resolve, where escalation was not restrained by proportionality, but encouraged by the desire to signal commitment and deter rival influence. And this environment mattered because it normalized extreme responses to perceived threats, reducing the threshold for intervention and increasing the likelihood that future crises would draw in external forces. And in broader Cold War terms, the war underscored a grim symmetry, that while superpowers viewed rapid intervention as evidence of strength and decisiveness, the societies affected experienced it as abrupt dislocation and long-term instability. a divergence that revealed how strategic success could coexist with humanitarian and political failure. And by tracing the Ogaden War's aftermath, it becomes clear that its significance lies not in the restoration of borders, but in the precedent it set, showing that alliances could flip instantly, wars could be transformed overnight, and regional actors could lose control of their own conflicts once global rivalry intervened, ensuring that the Horn of Africa's fate would remain intertwined with external calculation rather than local consent. And in this sense, the Ogaden War stands as one of the Cold War's most instructive proxy conflicts, because it revealed with rare clarity how power operated when ideology gave way to geography, and how the costs of that operation were borne disproportionately by those whose land became the arena for decisions made elsewhere. As the Cold War entered its final decade, the Ogaden War increasingly appeared in retrospect as a compressed preview of how proxy conflicts would shape the global South long after ideological certainty faded, because it revealed that the decisive factor in such wars was not belief but leverage. And this mattered because it showed that once superpowers demonstrated their willingness to reverse alliances and intervene at scale, local actors were forced to operate within a system where autonomy was sharply limited, and miscalculation carried existential risk. And for Ethiopia, the war's aftermath entrenched a governing strategy built around external indispensability, reinforcing the regime's dependence on Soviet backing while discouraging internal compromise, a posture that prolonged conflict and repression, even as it preserved territorial integrity. And this mattered because it ensured that victory hardened the very conditions that had destabilized the state, locking Ethiopia into cycles of militarization and humanitarian crisis that outlived the war itself. And for Somalia, the legacy was even more corrosive, because the defeat shattered the regime's founding narrative and exposed the hollowness of power derived from patronage rather than institutional resilience, accelerating the erosion of authority and social cohesion that would eventually culminate in state collapse. And this mattered because it illustrated how proxy defeat could destabilize a country far more profoundly than occupation or territorial loss. And at the regional level, the Ogaden War redefined expectations about conflict, normalizing the presence of foreign troops, advisors, and airlifts as acceptable instruments of regional politics, reducing the stigma attached to external intervention and embedding militarization into the Horn of Africa's strategic culture. And this normalization mattered because it narrowed the range of political solutions available to future crises, making escalation more likely and compromise less credible. And in Cold War historiography, the conflict has thus come to represent a moment when the illusion of ideological coherence gave way to the reality of transactional power, as socialism, nationalism, and anti-imperial rhetoric were all subordinated to strategic calculus. And by exposing these dynamics so starkly, the Ogaden War stands as a warning about the volatility inherent in proxy systems, showing that when global powers rush to secure influence, they often leave behind not stability, but enduring fragility, and that the true legacy of such wars is measured not by borders restored or alliances won, but by the long-term erosion of political agency in regions where decisions made far away can alter destiny overnight. In closing, the Ogaden War of 1977 to 1978 stands as one of the Cold War's most revealing proxy conflicts because it stripped away any illusion that ideology governed alliance behavior, exposing instead a system driven by geography, leverage, and speed. And what makes this war so significant is not simply the scale of the fighting or the drama of its reversals, but the clarity with which it demonstrated how abruptly power could pivot, transforming local ambition into strategic liability and revolutionary upheaval into a superpower battleground almost overnight. And this mattered because the war showed that client states were empowered only conditionally, their freedom to act existing solely within the bounds of patron tolerance. And once those bounds were crossed, support could be withdrawn without hesitation, reshaping the conflict's outcome with devastating effect. And for Ethiopia, the victory secured through Soviet arms and Cuban troops entrenched a model of survival dependent on external force rather than internal legitimacy, ensuring that militarization and repression would define governance long after the war ended. While for Somalia, the defeat exposed the fragility of a state built on nationalist promise and external backing, accelerating a downward spiral that no later realignment could arrest. And at the regional level, the Ogaden War entrenched the Horn of Africa as a zone of permanent strategic interest, where foreign intervention, arms flows, and alliance volatility became normalized features of political life, reducing the space for diplomacy and increasing the cost of miscalculation. And in broader Cold War terms, the conflict revealed how proxy wars functioned at their most extreme, with superpowers intervening decisively, not to resolve disputes, but to secure position, accepting chaos and long-term instability as acceptable byproducts of influence. And by exposing these dynamics so starkly, the Ogaden War offers a rare moment of analytical clarity, showing that at the Cold War's periphery, power was transactional, loyalty expendable, and outcomes determined less by ideology or justice than by the speed and scale of intervention, leaving behind a legacy defined not by territorial change, but by enduring fragility imposed on societies whose fate could be rewritten in a matter of weeks by decisions made far beyond their borders.